You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 237 of Foreign Policy Focus. I think you got a pretty special show put together for everybody today. I'm joined by two guests on today's show. The first, you all know very well, is Will Porter. He's a freelance journalist. His work can be found at libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com, and consortiumnews.com. And my second guest, you're probably familiar with if you know my work from the Libertarian Institute, and that is Patrick McFarlane. He is the host of the Liberty Weekly podcast and does great legal analysis and libertarian legal analysis work. And so these are my two guests on today's show. Will, Pat, how you guys doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on again, Kyle.
Yeah, doing real good. Thanks so much, Kyle.
All right. And so, what I brought you on today for kind of involves all three of us, as all of our work can be found at the libertarianinstitute.org. So if you're looking for the show notes on today's show, just go there and you find the show on the homepage. But one of the things the Libertarian Institute and Jared LaBelle started doing yesterday was this hashtag why I'm anti-war. And a lot of us commented on it, pretty much everybody you could think of in the libertarian anti-war movement. And many other people, even outside the kind of libertarian side of the anti-war movement, were out there tweeting the reasons that they were anti-war. So I thought it'd be really cool to bring these two guys on the show today, and we could all talk in a lot more detail than we just did on our tweets as to why we're all anti-war. So, kind of want to start off with the two specializations of my guests, Will Porter with journalism and Pat with kind of legal analysis. I'm going to kick over to Will first, just to talk a little bit about what the war state and what the American empire and continuous and endless war has done to kind of the state of journalism. Will?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a lot of reasons to be opposed to these wars, to be against the empire and whatnot. But one major reason is that it completely distorts and, skews our press, our fourth estate. Now, I think the press, like one of its major functions in a society, should be to sort of hold institutions of power to account. And sort of what we end up with in this situation where we have these endless wars is you end up with a press that really becomes sort of obsequious and, more loyal sort of to the war state and to the empire than it is to the people itself. And so you end up with major publications like the New York Times, for example, and the Washington Post, rarely ever, exercising the kind of skepticism you would expect from the fourth estate when they're trying to get us into these wars, such as, for example, the Iraq War. You had several prominent writers such as Judith Miller and William Safire and whatnot, who really helped to lie us into that war. And, you can see that happening again and again and again. And not only for lying us into the conflicts, but sort of just like refusing to keep us informed about them too. So we have the situation in Yemen as well, that the media is sort of just dropping the ball on. And so, yeah, I think in every way it's sort of, these wars sort of skew our press and make it less effective. And they end up really abetting and aiding the wars more than, holding the people waging them to account.
Right. Well, it creates this real culture of, we all have to be on board with the war and we all have to do things to support the war. And so I can't tell you how many journalists I've read where they've said things like, well, I felt it wasn't right to say anything because it was bad against the war effort and stuff like this. So, I guess that commentary probably gets pretty pervasive in the United States. You also have just economic incentives of the fact that like Lockheed Martin runs ads on Fox News all the time. And I'm sure if they have a bunch of Tucker Carlsons on there constantly bashing the war effort, then Lockheed might be a little less likely to run their ads. So, Will, I guess this would bring me to asking you just like, what are some alternatives, or do you have like two or three really good anti-war sources that you could give our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many to choose from. There's a really robust alternative independent media that's, I think, thriving right now, despite, all the social media kind of, I don't know if you call it censorship, but, yeah, I guess I would start with, the first would be consortiumnews.com, which is, the great investigative journalist Bob Perry's project. He's now passed away. Now that's edited now by Joe Lauria. So Consortium is just like a great, indispensable source, I'd say. I guess if you want like really good aggregation, like a site for that would be antiwar.com. You know, your listeners are probably familiar with that site, but there's so many other good websites that are linked out through there. And they also have a lot of good in-house news and commentary and stuff too. And I don't know, I guess off the top of my head, I would maybe choose, let's say Mondo Weiss, I think .net. That's another really good Middle East blog, but it mostly focuses on Israel and Palestine. And all of these sites are obviously pretty anti-war, non-interventionist.
Right. And, one of the things we've been seeing finally after, literally 3.5 years of talking about children being blown up pretty much every day is that there's some coverage of the Yemeni civil war and what is going on with U.S. made bombs in Saudi Arabia. And I just saw Caitlin Johnstone tweeting a couple days ago that, it was really all this coverage by the alternative media all this time. And then the event of the school bus bombing in Sadah there that killed 40 children, that's finally bringing the attention. So, Will, do you think that the alternative media is important to fighting the war state? And I guess, are we making any difference?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think the alt media or the independent media is absolutely essential. I mean, like you said, there's things like the situation in Yemen with the bombing of a school bus and stuff. If it weren't for people like us just screaming about this and constantly, tweeting about it and, being loud about it, I'm not sure how much of it would, I'm not sure how many mainstream journalists would feel sort of the obligation to pick up those stories. So like we're the pressure constantly, the conscience of the rest of the press, constantly pushing them to, hey, like cover these things. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
How like the fact that the alternative media has covered it maybe impacts what the mainstream media is doing and just how people perceive it.
Oh, right. Like, have we made a difference? Can we make a difference? Yeah. And absolutely, I think we can. We struggle constantly with viewership and stuff. And, there's issues with throttling and issues with getting Google to display your site prominently and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I think if we keep, clawing for viewership and for an audience, then yeah, absolutely. We can continue to make an impact and continue to like push some of these more obscure issues into the public consciousness.
So it does seem today that rather than there being necessarily a false narrative all the time about a lot of these Middle Eastern conflicts, think Syria, Yemen, or Afghanistan, like we had in the run up to Iraq War II, where they just lied about Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. The solution now is just disinterest and ignoring it. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily coordinated, but if you just talk to the average person, they have no idea what's going on in any of these countries. They probably don't know there's a war in Yemen at all. They have no idea about, the Operation Timber Sycamore to arm the Syrian rebels that turn out to be the Sunni jihadist groups that break off into ISIS and Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra or HTS in Syria and really form a giant problem that it's only then that Assad has to divide Iran and Russia into the country to solve it. And so rather than anybody doing good journalism and reporting that is just more or less ignored and rather than, just kind of the line. So Will, I guess kind of what hope do we have to get more coverage or what, I don't know, any kind of solution or something you'll say this before I kick it over to Pat?
Yeah. And just before I answer that, I just want to comment on something you pointed out. Like the media often does, there's sort of two ways that they can lie, and they can lie by commission or by omission. And so the way that they lie by commission is when they're lying us into the Iraq war, giving us actual falsehoods and telling us things that aren't true. And they do that pretty often, but I think more often they lie by omission. They just simply don't tell you about things and just leave you hanging, or they juxtapose information in a way that's suggestive and that's inaccurate. And so I think that's more common the way that they lie, more often the way they lie is by omission. But how do we win here? How do we continue? How do we, make more impact? I think we just keep pushing on. I mean, like we're going to constantly face adversity. We're going to constantly face people trying to limit our reach. Again, as we've been seeing on social media and whatnot for over a year, we've been seeing that happen. So yeah, I think if we just keep fighting against that, that's really all we can do is just keep pushing on,
I agree. And I think one of the probably the big things that alternative media is going to provide is not necessarily that we're changing minds in the moment, but that there is a record there. And all of these things could be found easily online by Googling. And, I'm trying to learn a little bit about John Brennan right now. And all I do is I go Google up John Brennan and I get tons of articles on all this guy's past crimes. And so it's fantastic that those resources are available. And I think when people, go and look back at, well, what the hell happened? Because, we had no idea any of this was going on, but was absolutely terrible and bankrupted our country. They will find all those articles at the Ron Paul Institute and at Mises and at Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com that explains every step of the way exactly what happened and how miserable the failure it was.
Right. So even if people today aren't paying too much attention, maybe future historians will find some use in this journalism.
All right, I want to shift gears a little bit and kick it over to Pat to talk about just some of the worst parts of the wars, kind of worst states' impacts on the U.S. laws and civil liberties. So, Mr. Pat, you just took the bar exam and you know all about all the laws. So tell us about the worst ones that the war state drove.
Yeah, most definitely, Kyle. And I just wanted to start off with a couple quotes here from Murray Rothbard. Well, the first one from George Orwell is that, the war is not meant to be won. The war is meant to be continuous. Also, war is the health of the state. I believe that's Smedley Butler. But Murray Rothbard also said, it is in war that the state really comes into its own, swelling in power, in number, in pride, in absolute dominion over the economy and the society. Furthermore, he also stated, what is war but mass murder on a scale impossible by private police forces? What is conscription but mass enslavement? Can anyone envision a private police force getting away with a tiny fraction of what states get away with and do habitually year after year, century after century? And the thing that I just wanted to focus on is that war is the mechanism by which our liberties are taken away. It is the mechanism by which some of the most deplorable events in humankind take place. And we can look no further than, after 2001. I've been reading Jeremy Scahill's Dirty Wars, and it's quite a tome, but I'm on the first couple chapters here. But he just has documented how, not only are we fighting the open wars, but we are also fighting these covert wars that no one really hears about. And just after 9/11, the response from the War Council, as they called it, eliminating they call it the presidential safeguards against covert assassinations. But just doing anything with the AUMF after 2001 but doing anything to justify, torture, kidnapping, all these things against, without due process and oftentimes against American citizens. And so when it comes, in setting up these CIA black sites that no one really knows about. But when it comes to that, you can just see it happening in real time. The erosion of our Fourth Amendment protections, the disposal of due process. You can go back all the way back, to Abraham Lincoln, even further back to the founding of the Republic, and see the first thing to go are civil liberties. And, in the Civil War, there was the imprisoning of journalists. You could see with the occupations of the South, and then in World War I with Woodrow Wilson silencing the press, and even in FDR's time in World War II. So those are always the things to go, and now it's, protecting against terrorism. We need to find the terrorists. So we're going to, create all these loopholes for the Fourth Amendment. And, then you get into endless wiretapping and the NSA's surveillance. And so all these things are interconnected.
Right. I think one of the things I just want to point out is that, this is continuous. It's not just the fact that, it's happening right now in present day America. We didn't pass the Patriot Act or the 2012 NDAA that allows for the indefinite detention of American citizens. It's that this is something that happens as a nature of war, and that this allows the governments to crack down on the people at home and for them to point out perceived threats all the time to scare people constantly, and leads to all these horrible things going on. And I think Will would point out too that if you look at journalism, this is a worldwide thing. It's not just American journalism, but certainly the mainstream press in Europe follows pretty much the same American line. And even though the UK is also heavily involved in the Yemeni civil war, there's almost no coverage from their mainstream BBC or Guardian type media on this at all. So, these are, pretty important that, this continues and is just part of what war is. Pat, I guess one of the things that it seems to do is bring power towards the federal government. We think about Amendments 1 and 4 really being stripped away in times of war, but Amendment 10, and I had even Mike Maharia, the 10th Amendment Center, on the show to discuss about how, states are looking to kind of reclaim the use of their National Guard forces that are being deployed overseas. So what do you think about, the 10th Amendment in war?
Well, I love the 10th Amendment. And it's funny. This goes all the way back to the beginning, way back to the War of 1812. And I've done a lot of work on the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and nullification. But one of the most beautiful chapters of American history, was during the War of 1812 when James Madison, Mr. Madison's War, in the invasion of Canada. And there were a lot of National Guardsmen, and I think it was Vermont or some of the, the northern states that refused to invade Canada. They said, we enlisted in the National Guard to protect Vermont. We are not going to go and kill our brothers up north. And so, maybe if we had a resurgence of that spirit, you could hope for that on a statewide level if all the states rebelled. And this kind of gets into Michael Bolden's work at the 10th Amendment Center, just doing everything that we can to fight back. And this was outlined in the Federalist Papers, actually, by people as antithetical to liberty as I think is Alexander Hamilton. But James, Alexander Hamilton even outlined, that the states have ability to do this, but specifically it was James Madison detailing exactly what to do if the federal government didn't listen to the states. And he recommended that the governors, lead a rebellion against the federal government.
The last thing I want to talk about on the legal side is just the erosion of the congressional war-making powers and how that's pretty much all ended up in the hands of the federal government now. And I think that just really adds into everything, as, we saw that, through the Cold War and through, the early 1990s and into 2000, the United States was heavily involved overseas, and we were getting into all kinds of these proxy fights, and there was never like a declaration of war. There was, various congressional authorizations from time to time to authorize certain things. But because there wasn't this declaration of war, America was able to meddle overseas. And then, as Scott Horton kind of says, on September 11th, 2001, those planes came out of the clear blue sky. And that's a perfect metaphor, because the Americans didn't realize our country was at war this whole time. And they were completely baffled as why anybody would attack us. But if you know the real history and have really paid attention, you know that we've been waging wars this whole time without congressional authorizations and killing a lot of innocent people overseas. And so, this was, September 11th was just another attack, this time against America on our soil, but, just of the continued American war and American empire that's been waged and oppressed on the Middle East. I guess you go back to 53 and the Iranian, the CIA did the coup and overthrew and put in place the Shah. So, that's, I think, kind of what we're looking at. But Pat, what do you think about, kind of the state of the presidential war powers today? I just saw this morning that, the congressional leadership actually stripped or, blocked the vote on a potential defunding of the Yemen civil war that, the United States has never authorized at all our participation in.
Well, I think the biggest problem you get into is with definitions and so when the Constitution says Congress has the power to make war, well, how do you attack that? Well, you change what the definition of war is. So when in the modern day, that's what I think we're facing is this vague term now of what war really means in the modern day. And, does it mean that we can have the CIA, meddling in the elections of other countries or, having these coups? Does this mean financial warfare when you can, manipulate your currency or when you conduct cyber attacks? And, I guess that's the thing that I would really pick at.
So, I wanted to bring Will back in, and Pat, feel free to jump in anytime here. And Will had some of the biggest reasons listed out to be anti-war. And so, Will, why don't you start, and give us the first couple you got?
Yeah, sure. I think first, just to echo what something Pat said, as libertarians, war is the health of the state. War grows government power in every way. So if you're concerned about reevaluating the role of the state in society, well, you really need to look at the war issue then. You have everything from, historically wars would lead to things like price controls and domestic, controls in society. So it doesn't just stay abroad. And then you have everything from presidential kill lists and stuff too. So it really, the war state grows the power of the state exponentially. But there's so many other reasons too. There's the monetary cost of it. There's, it costs us trillions of dollars now cumulatively. And I don't even know if anyone's tried to sort of tally up all of the war costs, like all together, at least in the 20th century and 21st century. It's almost incalculable. There's the cost in American lives, in our soldiers. There's the cost in people like civilians abroad, innocent people, a lot of whom are children or elderly or, people who are not even conceivably involved in the war effort. There's pollution. Like if you're an environmentalist, the Pentagon is among the greatest polluters on planet Earth. I mean, think about like depleted uranium that we're leaving all over the place. Think about the endless amounts of petroleum that the military burns. They're among the greatest polluters on planet Earth. And then there's even like a brain drain that the military has, the technology drain, all of the brilliant minds that are being pulled into the military industrial complex as opposed to being pulled into, producing consumer products. So, there's just countless ways. Like maybe we can riff off some of those, but there's so many other ways that war, impoverishes us entirely as a society.
Yeah. And I think it'd be hard to put it better than you said. But in just remembering, why we got into Ron Paul in the first place. The biggest issue I think is central banking, or one of the biggest issues. And to go back to, the invention of central banking was in England when the king needed to go to parliament, to get permission to go to war because all of the council and all the kings and all the nobility controlled the purse strings. Well, when you have a central bank that can loan you money, just print it out of thin air, or when you can debase the currency and essentially steal from the people. And we're also, I think we've left out the domestic wars at home. There's the war on drugs, which I would count in being a real war. Our police have been militarized. There's so much more crime now because there are more crimes on the books. And, I think one of the biggest reasons, and I've written about this before, but one of the biggest reasons why the colonists revolted against the British Empire is because they were an occupying force. And I believe that in the modern day, because of the war on drugs, it's all cyclical, is that we have the wars abroad where they test out all this new equipment, and they buy it. And then after they're done using it there, Radley Belko has done a lot of work on this. It comes home and then they give it to civilian police agencies and then it's used against our population. And, so those are just some more reasons to be anti-war.
Right. And to touch on the drug war, I've actually had, Brian Sadie on the show a few times to talk about this topic. And just because the American drug trade is such a huge business, not only is a war on drugs a war against the American people, but what it does to the economies and the people of Central America is also absolutely devastating. And it is the cause, as well, as American kind of CIA and covert meddling in those countries, the drug trade and creating that massive multi-billion-dollar black market is another huge problem, for a lot of those countries. And then, kind of the criminal element that's produced when you now have this massive billion-dollar market and you say, oh yeah, you also can't use any kind of legitimate courts to enforce the contracts or anything like that. So anytime anybody rips anybody off, there's only one way to settle it, and that's kind of through violence. So very unfortunate how, that ends up getting set up and being another problem in Central and South America. Will, I just want to emphasize the brain drain and kind of the opportunity cost of our war. If you look at, we're looking at 5.56 trillion, I think is one of the numbers I've seen, on the amount of money the United States has spent in Iraq and Afghanistan post 9/11. And then you look at all those young men and women who went to fight and all the research and engineers who went to build the weapons. Where we could be, would the United States even need the Middle Eastern oil at this point, or could we not care just at all about all those people living in the desert and just kind of go back to that attitude towards the people of the Middle East? Had we, spent that money at home and had those, nuclear engineers instead of been building, different nuclear weapons, or the people who are building, the different kind of engines that, power the, aircraft carriers and the submarines and all that, being gone to like making more effective and, better civilian energy sources, I think it's hard to, believe, what life could be like in 2018 had we not wasted all of our time, all of our energy, all our labor. And also, now we have all these legacy costs, not just the war on the debt, which is, trillion, or the interest on the war debt, which is trillions of dollars, but also in all these young men and women who either didn't come back or have came back mentally or physically disabled and are now going to live less fulfilling lives than they would have otherwise. I know that it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but that's the reality of the situation created by the war.
Right, no doubt. I mean, we've discussed on your show, Kyle, the effects on the veterans, the people who fight these wars and come home. And, there are thousands of people right now who have severe psychological issues and mental health issues and who need urgent, aid and care. And they're just not getting it. And we sort of have this gigantic liability building up in our society as these people return home. And as you mentioned on the monetary side too, I mean, if you just think about like someone's yearly salary, how many times does that fit into $1 trillion? How many business startups could you finance through those trillions of dollars? It's insane the amount of like actual wealth that could be created. But instead, not only do we spend this wealth for the purpose of, the warfare, but on the other end too, we destroy things. So, we take someone's yearly salary for a guided bomb, and then we blow up someone else's house with it. So it's like a double, it's doubly destructive.
Right. Yeah. We're not, talking about kind of helicopter fiat money that's being destroyed. We're talking about real wealth. We're talking about steel that goes into all these tanks and planes, all the advanced computer equipment that goes into all the radar systems, the fuel that goes into the missiles, all this, fuel and energy spent transporting them around is, incalculable. How much we have spent and what the opportunity costs of all that have been. Pat, did you have anything to add on to Will's list there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a terrific example of Frederick Bastiat's parable of the seen and the unseen, and Henry Hazlitt gets into that too. So we're even getting back, to libertarianism economics 101, Austrian economics. But I'm going to bring this back to Ron Paul again because I come from the conservative side of things, and I think that just the message of his what if speech should really ring true. If the tables were turned and a foreign army was building military bases and stockpiling forces on our borders, if Canada was doing this, or if Mexico was doing this, or if we had perceived, we're already upset that quote unquote Russia is meddling in our elections, which is bogus. But if we had perceived, just think of how angry people are about that. If we had perceived that, Russia was, taking out people on their hit list inside of our country, or, if the tables were turned, Texans would be very mad if, Saudi Arabia was bombing civilian targets inside Texas. I think that's pretty common sense here. So, we need to step back from America being, the superpower, which it has been our entire lives, and think about it from another perspective, and think that it's not unreasonable for civilians in other countries to feel this way. So that's one thing I would focus on too.
All right. So the deal with the Libertarian Institute is that this was on Twitter and was a Twitter hashtag, and I think we all contributed our own tweets there. So I want to give Will and Pat the opportunity to kind of say what your why I'm anti-war tweet is, and expand on it as much as you want to, so our audience really understands why we are anti-war.
Yeah, sure. I guess I can start. I actually tweeted out a couple why I'm anti-war, just like reasons. And a lot of them are along the lines of what we talked about here. But I think one of them was sort of just like, because our wars here in America, we spend trillions of dollars. We steal it from our own citizenry. We impoverish our own country for the sake of murdering people abroad. And so I don't know. I think that's sort of the most succinct way to put it.
Yeah. And mine as well. Twitter.com/Liberty Weekly @Liberty Weekly. I outlined, the Ron Paul reasons why, but also blowback theory, and this is officially recognized. People tend to hate you when you massacre their families and destroy their neighborhoods. I think I pulled that from Dave Smith, so I can't take credit for that comment. But I think it's pretty straightforward here. But I've done a lot of work, and I think I have a Liberation Library series where I do book reviews, and I reviewed Dave Grossman's On Killing, where he studies the psychology of soldiers killing in combat, and just all the conditioning that the U.S. government and the Army has done on this topic too. Because one beautiful thing out of it is that soldiers are or people in general have a very innate biological reaction against killing their own kind. It's a gut reaction. In their memoirs, a lot of soldiers will talk about how their first kill, they were revulsed and they vomited. And so throughout history, and I'll try and be brief here, but General S.L.A. Marshall did a study way back in World War II where he realized that in any given engagement with the enemy, only 1 out of every 5 soldiers, quote, would take any part with their weapons. Any part. So only 1 out of 5 soldiers was firing their weapons in any engagement. And in those engagements, many of them were purposely shooting over the enemy or missing the enemy and posturing instead of actually trying to kill the enemy. And what they found was at the last minute in their heart, most men became conscientious objectors and they just could not go through with it. And I think that's a very beautiful lesson. And, it is sad because now the firing rates are at 99 to 100%, and they've done reflexive fire training with the U.S. military. And I think there's a lot of moral injury that goes with that. Even more so, maybe exacerbated from how it was a long time ago. And they went back through history and found that this was the case in every single engagement. They would find Civil War muskets that had loads stacked inside the bore and inside. And because soldiers would, not fire their weapons purposely, they would just reload and not shoot. So, Ron Paul has done a lot of work on this, talking about, stories of humanity, human stories. The story he always tells of, I don't know if it was the sniper or the pilot who crashed with his trumpet and he was playing Silent Night or something like that. And all the boys on the American side, it was a German soldier, just related to him, and they just couldn't kill him. So I think we need to realize that these are just young boys that we're sending off to kill each other.
Yeah, my tweet was war destroys life and wealth, and I really hit the wealth thing so far on the show. But my real philosophy is just individualism. Everybody is one individual person, and nobody is more valuable than anybody else. And so the lives of all those people in the Middle East matter just as much as the lives of the people in the United States. And to go kill a bus full of Yemeni children or, a funeral hall, blow that up in Yemen, kill 150, to blow up a bomb shelter in a civilian bomb shelter in Iraq, to, kill with snipers the Palestinian protesters, or to drop bombs on a Syrian mosque or an Afghan hospital. It's all the same, that we all have those lives. And, people, I constantly see the politicians who make the decisions to have these wars sit there so flippantly and say, oh, well, that's the cost of civilian life. But it's never their life. It's never the life of their family. And when you realize that those people have just as much value as anybody else, I think it's pretty simple why war is just about the worst thing that could possibly happen in the world. And, when you factor in the fact that it doesn't even help anybody. I guess it would be one kind of different thing if, we waged all these terrible wars and did all these really horrific things. But at the end of the day, you could say, well, from a utilitarian philosophy standpoint, things got better, but you never can. And so it's just all around, the worst kind of thing that could happen in the world. And, I guess just thank God nobody's, dropped a nuke, in the past 70 years or so. So, I think unless either of you have something to say, we'll wrap up.
That sounds good to me, Kyle.
All right. So
yep, that should be fine.
I'll let both of you plug your sites and where you want to send people, and, especially your Twitters. And everybody get out there on Twitter, #WhyI'mAntiWar, and tweet at the Libertarian Institute, myself, Will Porter, and Pat McFarlane. Will, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, you can find my work at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org, in the blog and at the featured articles section. You can find me sometimes at antiwar.com in the viewpoints, and Consortium News lately as well. Oh, and on Twitter, you can find me at WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And then also, if you really want to support my work, you really like what I do, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist.
Yeah, and you can find me at libertyweekly.net, also at libertarianinstitute.org. On the right hand, if you scroll down on the last podcast on the right, the Liberty Weekly podcast, on Twitter at twitter.com/Liberty Weekly. And I did a full, a 50-minute documentary on, the conditioned killers, what I was just speaking of. And you can find that at libertyweekly.net /LL4. That's the letters LL and the number 4. But that's just about it. Thanks so much, Kyle. I really appreciate you having me on.
All right. I'll link to that episode and a link for each of you guys on the show notes page for people who want to find that. And really the best place to find all of our work is at the libertarianinstitute.org. And thanks so much for, Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, and Jared LaBelle who put that platform together for those of us to get our work out there to you guys. And, this kind of cool idea from Jared LaBelle that I hopped on and did this podcast for. So, we're all anti-war. This is why we're anti-war. And, hopefully, y'all got a little bit out of today's podcast. You find my show at, like I said, libertarianinstitute.org or foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Twitter is at KYAAALE. And then you could, donate to the show if you really like it at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And for those of you who do that and donate to myself, Will, or Pat, you only have to donate to one of us, not all of us. You'll get some awesome bonus content that we're about to put together after, we finish up with this show. So thanks everybody for, tuning in, and, we'll do some bonus content for those of you who want to listen more, but I'm sure I'll have both of these guys back on the show in the future.